Thank you, Bruce, and thank you, everyone, for waiting until this panel and not leaving instantly, because I know how hard it is when you're at the end of a busy day. But we do have some very interesting people to talk to you on this panel today, and we really want to talk about a topic dear to my heart, which is 21st century government. And the way I like to think about this is if the 20th century was the bureaucratic century, when bureaucracy was created, when bureaucracy took over, was the dominant government and economic form in most countries, what is the 21st century? And some of you have a copy of the book I wrote recently where I made a first attempt at looking at 21st century government. And in that context, I said, looking around the world, but particularly at the United States, there were really three emerging models of government happening. One we call simply reinvented government. Government that takes the best from the private sector, government that uses information technology aggressively and smartly, government that tries to be as efficient as possible, and government that tries to be sensitive to the citizen and to the customer. We've seen lots of examples of reinvented government, both in the United States and around the world. Many countries in the world have citizens' charters taken from originally created in the United Kingdom, but spread to many countries as far away as India and Africa. Many countries are using performance measurement. When I was a graduate student at Berkeley back in the 1970s, we didn't talk about performance measures. We didn't talk about efficiency. They talked about that over at the business school, right? These days, of course, the guts of reinvented government is a concern for efficiency, for effectiveness, and for productivity, which we see in many, many countries around the world. So this is a revolution that we are in the middle of. It is certainly not without its problems. Certainly in places like the UK that have used performance measures quite aggressively, we have also seen quite a lot of examples of gaming and cheating on performance measures. We've seen that here in the United States, in the states that have used them. Nevertheless, this is a well-established movement for the 21st century bureaucracy. There are two other governmental forms that I want to just present to you because you see examples of them all the time and all around the world. One I call government by network, and this is where the state creates a network and does the work of the state through other means. We're going to have a terrific example when we hear from Lee Bowes about government by network, because it's used extensively in the United States, particularly in the area of social services. In fact, Marty Litsky, one of our members of the audience right here, wrote a whole book about this topic several years ago and the use of this in the social services area. So government by network is really a kind of an old but also very new piece of government, and it's a new tool that people in government have available to them. It too is not without its problems. There's much cheating and misbehavior in government contracts, people being people. That happens inevitably. And government is not yet really adept at managing these far-flung networks that it has created. And therefore, they're not getting the efficiency out of them. They're not getting the learning out of them that they should. And finally, I talk about government by market as another feature of 21st century government. And this is where the state decides to use its power to create a market where none existed before. And if we in the United States ever get serious about climate change, which I suspect we will as soon as we get rid of this president and get another one, by the way, Democrat or Republican, doesn't matter, it will be better than this one. as soon as we move to looking at getting serious about climate change, we will quickly come up against the following problem. Bureaucracy will not be able to deal with climate change, nor will government networks and contracts. In fact, the government will have to get seriously into the business of creating markets to achieve public goals. It's the only way you can possibly even begin to cope with something like climate change in a democracy. And that, perhaps, of these three models is the one we know the least about, and yet the one that is probably most interesting for some of the new and emerging issues of the 21st century, getting the markets right, creating markets for public goods. And so I've been thinking about these three kinds of models. I've been thinking about what kinds of policy problems are best adapted to these models, or which ones. And I want to conclude and then introduce my panelists with the following thought. Policymakers in the 1950s had one option before them: identify a problem, create a bureaucracy, staff it with civil servants, and proceed to try and solve the problem. Policymakers in the 21st century have in front of them a vast menu of governmental technologies, ranging from reinvented bureaucracies to systems of contracts and networks to actual creation of markets. Never before have we had available this range of ways of implementing public policy. And therefore, it's a quite exciting period of time. And lots of people around the world in different countries under different situations are using some of these, even though they may not actually be conscious of, of what they're doing, or they're not calling them the way I've called them. So that's what I've attempted to do in my book, which you have, and in some of my studies, and I'll be happy to talk about this later. But before we do that, what I want to do is turn to the panel and talk to three examples of 21st century government, because we have three terrific panelists. And I think what I will do is introduce all of you so that you can see sort of how this panel fits together. Let everyone speak, and then we'll open it up for some questions and comments. To my right is Maryantonett Flumian. She is a senior fellow at the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs program for networked government. She holds degrees from the University of Toronto and the University of Ottawa, and she is completing her doctoral studies at the University of Ottawa on the administrative history of the Treasury Board Secretariat of Canada, which is one of the big innovators in the world of government. She was executive in residence, Jarodlowski Chair in Public Management in 2006, and became senior fellow, Graduate School of Public and International Affairs at the University of Ottawa in 2007. Professor Flumian is a seasoned senior executive at the deputy minister level in the Canadian Federal Public Service, with more than 20 years of large-scale operational experience in the economic, social, and federal provincial domains. She is the visionary that created Service Canada, the federal government's focal point for one-stop service delivery to Canadians that places the needs, expectations, and priorities of citizens and communities at the center of the design and delivery of services. Anybody who has not looked at this site really must. It's quite amazing, and it was one of the first in the world, if not the first in the world, to do it. Professor Flumian sits on the advisory board of the Harvard Policy Group, Leadership for a Networked World, at the John F. Kennedy School of Government, and the advisory group of Government 2.0, Wikinomics, Government, and Democracy. She's going to talk about her latest innovation, even though, frankly, she has such a long career of innovations that I'm sure she'll talk about many of them in the Q&A. After we hear from Maryantonett, I want to have Lee Bowes come up. Lee Bowes Maryantonett's the redhead. Lee Bowes is the blonde. See, this is going to be easy to do. She's the Chief Executive Officer at America Works, a post she has filled since 1987. And America Works figures prominently in my book as an example of government by network, and a lot of what I've learned about that came from hanging out with Lee and studying the organization she founded. While a graduate student at Columbia University School of Social Work, she formulated the theory that work should be central social policy. Rather than emphasizing income support and social services, policy should be directed towards providing employment. In 1978, Dr. Bowes joined the nonprofit Transitional Employment Enterprises. The Ford Foundation and MDRC founded this to operate the National Supported Work Demonstration. It was here she designed the private sector model that is the foundation of America Works. Currently, Dr. Bowes directs all activities of America Works' $7 million business. It is a 25-year-old for-profit company, and it has placed 100,000 people in jobs throughout the United States. America Works has advocated particular policy initiatives that have included welfare reform, performance-based contracting, work first, and most recently, prison to work. Dr. Bowes also serves as an adjunct professor at Columbia University's School of International and Public Affairs, where she lectures on human resource management, social policy, and innovative management techniques. She has recently published a book on human resource management under contract with Harper's, and is widely published in journals such as The New Democrat, The Entrepreneurial Economy, and Social Policy Research. She holds a doctorate in sociology from Boston University. And last but not least, the only man on this panel, but therefore we really welcome him. Carlo Flamment was born in Rome in 1955. In 1978, he graduated from La Sapienza University in Rome with first-class honors in economics. Between 77 and 78, he studied at the London School of Economics, and then at EMID in Switzerland and INSEAD at Fontainebleau in France. He became a member of the board of directors, and in 1993 was elected president of FILAS, which is the business development agency of the Lazio region in Italy. From 1993 to 1997, he's held the position of counselor and president of the council committee Roma Capitale for the Jubilee 2000. In December 1999, he was nominated president of Formez, a position he currently holds. So I'm going to let each of these come up, and each of these distinguished innovators come up and talk about what they have been doing most recently. And I want Maryantonett to come up first, followed by Lee, followed by Carlo, and then we will have some questions and some discussion after we hear these examples of 21st century government.
Grazie, Elaine. Carlo, si fa il discorso in italiano? We had a discussion about at least 3 of us up here have Italian ancestry. But we'll do this in English. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's a pleasure to see so many people hanging in for the last panel, as Elaine has already said. The example that I'm going to use today, because we have a very few minutes, so I'll get quickly to the chase, is one that I could have used many others, but it's one that I'm working on currently, and that draws on a lot of the experience I've had and the thinking that I'm doing and have been doing in terms of setting up this one-stop experience that Elaine referred to for citizens in Canada, known as Service Canada. Why, of all the things that I could talk about, did I choose to highlight an innovation in the area of something so boring as identity management? Well, here's my view. Notwithstanding at least 30 years of considerable investments in technology, and many, many hundreds of examples of innovation that we've seen around the world, I will argue that we have made little systemic or transformational change in how we actually collect and manage information across governments. And the other reality is that as individuals and all the interactions we have with governmental and non-governmental players, A little piece of our identity is to be found in lots of places. But I will also argue that I'm not talking about creating the mother of all databases, to misquote another famous actor in history. There is actually no need to consolidate this data. There's just an important requirement to verify the data. So yet, with all of this, verifying and confirming identity is required for virtually all transactions in government. Eligibility is often then determined. For all of you who've worked in the area of social policy, this issue of redistribution and reaching those most in need in the social welfare context is a question that bedevils many of us. Even in evolved e-government areas like Canada, where we should be able to reach those citizens most in need who have an entitlement to a benefit, we do a very poor job of it. So how do we manage to lower the bureaucratic hurdles of government so that people can actually receive those benefits? And how do we also deal with the issues of making sure that the wrong people don't get the benefit that they are not entitled to? And in some jurisdictions, Canada is not one of them, how do we deal with the issues of fraud? So having said all this, here's my thesis. My thesis is that we need to apply a very different kind of thinking to how we manage the role of government in this identity space. In a way that governments can facilitate greater protection for citizens and their identity and related information. In a way that governments can provide the frameworks to better safeguard identity. And in a way that governments can provide the frameworks and the systems to provide greater ease for interactions with government. But notwithstanding everything I've said, my 25 years of experience as a senior official in the Government of Canada leads me to continue to run up against the practical reality that how we manage identity, how we collect and share that information, is a real impediment to the kind of change that actually leads to transformation. It's a constant that's often repeated in any conversations we have about transforming how we manage programs, where we continue to collect repeatedly information through multiple application processes, determine eligibility yet again for each one of those programs, and we do this again and again and again. Now let me leave that aside for a moment and move on to a further observation. When we used to have these discussions at a senior level in a pre-9/11 world, what we were most concerned about was the absolute privacy of personal information. And the absolute privacy of individual personal information was the boogeyman that we all wrestled with. How could we possibly ever join up services? How could we possibly ever have a holistic view of citizens' needs? And again, especially in a social context. Because our primary importance was always to safeguard the absolute privacy of information. That was in a pre-9/11 world. In a post-9/11 world, in many of our countries, especially in Canada as well, we're no longer worried about that boogeyman. What's happened is, in most cases, this whole issue about identity and how it's managed has moved to the spectrum of how security agencies will manage identity. And they don't have the same concerns about those boogeymen that those of us who worked in the social welfare area had. I'll go further to say that in terms of these discussions about identity and the importance of collecting and managing this information, social service areas and the service delivery areas have by and large vacated the space, and they don't play in the policy discussions at all, having left it virtually entirely to the security agencies to deal with these issues. But if you look at all of those that have an interest in identity, perhaps we can look at identity on a continuum. And if we do that, maybe we can see the future differently. So my continuum for managing identity starts with birth and ends with death, just like identity does. But if you look at that continuum and the network with which your identity interacts, I think you have a more robust and potentially a very different way of looking at identity. Identity and managing it is still the responsibility of individual citizens. But they do interact for all sorts of real purposes with multiple levels of government. And even if they don't think they're interacting with other governments than their own, the moment they cross an international border, they're also interacting with international levels of government. Private sector institutions especially the financial sector, also has a huge piece of our identity invested in what they do. And in the social services context, NGOs that often act as the service intermediaries after eligibility has been determined are also huge players in this space. If we look at it this way, then we have a very different and perhaps more practical way of dealing with this very important and complex set of issues. And therefore, we can set the framework for identity and its management in a very different way. And now I'll just quickly summarize the innovation that I have been asked to talk about today against that backdrop. What's the innovation that we're talking about trying to address? This issue of identity management and what we did in Canada in a particular jurisdiction of Ontario. We have research that was done in Canada and that's supported by much of what's happening in parts of the rest of the world, that citizens find government complex, fragmented, frustrating, and pretty hard to access. Citizens tell us in 15 years of research that they want timely, consistent, personalized, and far more convenient service. They will and actually do consent to the sharing of information if it's more convenient to transact with governments and the appropriate safeguards are put in place. So acting with this consent to how this information can be used, we actually have tried to share it with multiple jurisdictions with the appropriate, or indeed in most cases, enhanced levels of protection that do enable governments to serve citizens in a far more transparent fashion, and by the way, also reduce the cost of that service. And there are lots of ways of capturing the savings, and I'll talk about that in a moment. So we took a process that began with the registration of births in the province of Ontario, working with the Government of Canada. And we tried to take a very lengthy and time-consuming process that at the time when we started to implement this innovation took up to 18 months to receive a birth certificate, 18 months after birth to receive a birth certificate. And the birth certificate in an identity context begins the process for receiving all sorts of other documentation, as you well know. So with birth begins this process of establishing this identity and starting to create it, if you will. Managing identity, creating and attesting to the existence of people is one of the most important roles that government will continue to play. And it becomes more important every day as we are deeper and deeper into this virtual world. But it's complicated, and it actually engages governments across all departments and jurisdictional boundaries, as I've already said. It involves many, many departments, and at that point involved multiple forms and application processes. Some of these processes had to be undertaken in person to prove you were actually about to give birth, for example. We weren't prepared to accept that from you on the phone or by mail. And some of these processes could only be undertaken by mail. And the application and issuance of these documents had to follow a predetermined sequencing that wasn't always obvious to the citizens applying for the documentation. At a minimum, parents were forced to go through a time-consuming and complex process, completing 3 separate application processes for 3 different levels of government. One for birth registration, which was done at the municipal level, one for birth certification, which issues the birth certificate, which is done at the provincial level, and one for a social insurance number, which is done at the federal level. All submitting birth registration to all these parties, waiting for confirmation before they could apply for the next step. And on it went. So what is the innovation that I've been talking about? To describe it as quickly as I can, we created the newborn registration service, where parents are enabled to register their baby's birth, apply for the child's birth certificate and the social insurance number all at the same time. Before parents leave the hospital, they're provided with a birth information packages, which encourages them to apply for their baby's registration online. When they do so, they are offered the additional service of requesting the birth certificate and the social insurance number without having to go through 3 separate application processes and without having to duplicate the information that's required in each, because, by the way, when you compare the information, it's almost identical, if not identical. This is complicated in a place like Canada because the management of vital events is constitutionally within provincial jurisdiction. We operate in a federal state. And up until this point, that had been used as the excuse for no progress on this file. Of course, over time, what this does is result in the fact that all levels of government are collecting the same information, managing it in their own way for their own purposes, and not to mention setting up systems that couldn't talk to each other at that time in any case. But if you look at it in a very different way, putting the citizen at the center, you actually allow multiple levels of government to work together in a different way for the citizen's benefit. It took a great deal of dialogue, time and trust to build the relationships that allowed all the governmental actors to put the interests of the citizen ahead of their program, their budgets, and their traditional methods of delivery, because every system had its own method of delivery. People have spoken many times on panels over the last 2 days about how the biggest impediments to transformation are cultural, and it was the same in this case. Trust had to be developed, and the model that was implemented respected all jurisdictional issues. We didn't say this level of government need not apply, need to be wiped out. We didn't even do this through legislative change. We just did it by applying some common sense to what the rules allowed us to do. So trusting one jurisdiction to collect the information and manage the transfer of information to the others was at the heart of this innovation. By the way, comparing that data across 3 levels of government only enhanced the integrity and the quality of the data, because if there were errors, they were caught, because now you had 3 things to compare them to. So through this partnership, new possibilities were explored for change and improvements. There was a team set up, first at the very senior level of both federal and provincial governments. We then got enough agreement to set up a dedicated project management team. And then, of course, at the working level, we set up joint business and technology teams that also allowed this work to take place. But it took almost 2 years to begin to implement the innovation, and we used a very multidisciplinary approach to how this was to be done. In terms of the results, we streamlined 3 application processes into 1 integrated online service. We cut the time of processing important identity documents at first in half, and now we've gone from a 1.5 years to a couple of weeks to issue those important identity documents. As a matter of fact, the province of Ontario, if they don't provide your registration of your birth and a birth certificate within 10 days of application, you get your money back. Mm-hmm. That's the kind of guarantee that they have adopted as a result of this innovation. The service offers assurances to the parents that the privacy of their personal information is protected. It receives their consent to share the information across the 3 levels of government. And the service also has the advantage of enhancing the data captured and maintaining it in registers in an accurate fashion, because you're no longer entering paper information. And the electronic application process greatly reduces the numbers of errors that tend to plague all those paper-based processes. And you're also reducing all the processing cost of that manual documentation that we talked about. And we have not, in this process, created 1 database. Now, there's no doubt that developing these partnerships leverages the potential for collaboration across governments. By leveraging each other's capabilities, governments are able to improve service at the same time as lowering costs for all the levels of government I've talked about. I'd argue that the collaboration potential is enormous. And in this model, governments also are allowed to share the back office. And that is an important contributor to how people can also leverage what they have. It also very quickly adds greatly to the number of services that can now be added on. So now these levels of government are looking at the same trigger to begin to issue health cards for health services, passports, almost issued at birth, children's education savings grants, the issuance of child tax benefits, and child care payments that are also made and triggered at birth. The possibilities are actually endless, and I'm sure that when we get into the question and answer sessions, I could talk a lot more. I would just say quickly in closing that identity is only as strong as the weakest link. This process allowed us to identify the weak links and repair them or replace them. It also brought to us a discipline where we mapped out all existing processes, the real needs for information, not the perceived needs, and the real needs of the citizens and how that information should be managed. It led to a far greater discipline, a more holistic treatment of the data and its use, and it frees up people so they can move from processing to being caseworkers, which is what most of them came to government for. So I would argue that identity can only be appropriately managed on a continuum that builds on the strengths of the vaster network, which we can talk about in greater detail during the Q's and A's. Thank you, Elaine.
Thank you very much. A terrific example of modern and 21st century government and information technology in a core governmental function. Lee, your turn.
Thank you, Elaine. Every time I go through customs, I always say to my husband, Peter, thank God for Elaine Kamarck, because if you went through customs prior to the Clinton-Gore administration, you spent hours waiting in line. And if you go through customs as a U.S. citizen coming back into the United States, you are amazed at the efficiency. And that was only one of about 1,000 things she did. So I'm really grateful to you for that, among many other innovations you did. I thought I'd talk about how we in our daily lives, doing what we do in a small way, can create an innovation. And I'll start by talking a little bit about America Works' work on welfare and then welfare reform. But I also wanted to emphasize something new, because we are involved in trying to create a new innovation, a prison-to-work innovation, which we think will be sort of a revolution in the next social policies of the United States, which is getting former prisoners to work quickly. And we're in the middle of it, and so we have a lot of problems with it, and I thought that would be interesting. America Works is 25 years old, and we've placed over 100,000 people in jobs. We're a for-profit business, which when we started was very controversial, the idea that you would create a for-profit. But we had a very innovative board of business people, and they said, how do you think you're going to spread these ideas and develop companies around the country unless you have investors? It's like, investors? What are investors? We had no idea. But you need capital to do things. And so we were very fortunate back in Massachusetts in the late 1970s, early 1980s, to have people thinking about that. And we formed a for-profit, and we got business partners involved. Purpose of our for-profit was twofold: to place people in jobs, but also to advocate for policy reforms. And we came up with a paradigm that really spoke to how to change the social welfare system that seemed to feel that people on welfare didn't want to go to work, couldn't go to work, shouldn't go to work. The first thing we said was to the government agencies, only pay us if we get someone a job, and pay us only if they get a job and they stay in a job for a period of time. That may sound commonplace and commonsensical to you now, but for those involved in a revolution in what we call performance-based contracting, reinventing government, that was considered unheard of. You paid for classrooms, you paid for lights, you paid for staff. You didn't pay for outcomes, and you certainly didn't guarantee outcomes with the risk of losing money. So that was one of our first principles. The second thing was this notion of work first. Everyone thought that to get a poor person a job, you needed to address a whole host of problems, that they were troubled people, that they needed social services, counseling, treatment programs, they needed education and training, and then maybe 10 years later you'd get them a job. We said no. From our experience, they want to go to work, they're motivated to go to work, they can go to work, and you know what? Businesses like them. That was the second principle, which was work first. The third principle was support once they had the job. I think it was David Elwood and Mary Jo Bain who did the studies showing people often could get jobs, but they couldn't keep jobs. And in a 10-year period, people on welfare got many jobs, they never stayed in them. So we sort of looked at that and said, how do we intervene right at the workplace? How do we go into the place of work, help them learn? And, you know, I know this is going to sound strange to you, but private sector businesses are managed very poorly, especially at the entry level. And we would place people into a job in which the supervisor never told them what they were supposed to do. There were no expectations, no clear directions, and of course they'd lose their job. So a lot of what we ended up doing was on-the-job coaching. But we also did outside supports, very important. The kinds of things that most of in the social service world believed you needed to do that after they got or before they got the job. We did it afterwards. We said, what's the triage? What do they need? Do they need housing? Do they need childcare? So that was a third principle. And the fourth thing we did was we did a business-to-business marketing. 100 cameras in our classroom with welfare recipients, and there was Mario Cuomo and Rudolph Giuliani, and they were both saying, you know, we believe in welfare reform. And we ended up getting all kinds of feedback from that. But you have to understand that at that time, there was this building of a public perception that something had to change. Mayors and governors had increased welfare rolls, irrespective of the unemployment rates. Welfare rolls were continuing to go up. And in the United States, welfare was paid for 50% by local governments. So they were being crushed by it. They were looking for solutions. We innovated by doing our little programs and asking people to look at it, and then people at think tanks like the DLC, the Manhattan Institute, certain politicians sort of grabbed onto the idea, they ran with it, they wanted to run with it. But it really wasn't until President Clinton was running for office and he ran on ending welfare as we know it, that America Works. I have 3 minutes. Okay. How did that happen? Was I? Okay.
Take another 2.
Thank you, Elaine. You're so kind. These are all Italians, and I just always wanted to be Italian. And I'm not, so they're so kind and generous people, the Italians. I have 2 more minutes. But it was then that the president adopted this policy, and the Clinton-Gore White House passed finally a welfare reform bill. 10 years, 12 years later, 60% reduction in the welfare rolls. You don't know how unbelievable that is as a social policy. That was believed to be a cause for sending homeless people into the streets, children going starving. The fact that 60% of those rolls are reduced is remarkable. And today in New York City, when a woman goes in to register for welfare, they get an emergency grant. They are sent to America Works, and we immediately get them working again. They never even have to enter the welfare rolls. So it's a truly remarkable innovation for which we played a very small part, but we felt like we were part of a broader movement. And I just want to say briefly about what we're embarked on now. We decided that the fathers are also important. And we never could really get traction with the non-custodial, the parents of the children on welfare through welfare reform, but many of those men are in prison. In the United States, 7.3 million people are in the criminal justice system. That means they're in local jails, state, federal prisons, they're in parole or probation. That is astronomical. A 300% increase in people in criminal justice in 20 years in our country at a tremendous social and financial cost. 30% of African American men between 18 and 35 are in the criminal justice system. Just think about that, 30%. It's really quite shocking. And when people return from prison, 67% actually return to prison after they leave, go home, they go back. There are a lot of reasons for this. Some of them are idiosyncratic, but some of them are quite profound. We have learned, for example, that all our prisons in the United States are built in rural areas. Rural areas are Republican districts. They are counted for congressional districting as Republican votes or citizens, even though they live in inner cities and return without voting rights to inner cities. So we have a congressional system that is probably $2 million people over what it would be if we changed that ruling. The prisoners have debts. They accumulate debt while they're in prison. They have child support. People we see coming out have sometimes $100,000 worth of child support, back payment for crimes they committed, for public defenders that they had. So they return home already with this burden, an undue burden. The parole officers, I'll never forget this Detroit parole officer saying to us, you know, he didn't show up on time for his interview. I saw him with a flat tire and changing the tire, but he was 10 minutes late for the interview. I sent him back to prison. The guy lost the job. He went back to prison. He became anonymous once again. And the parole system itself is totally designed to reoffend and send people back. There are other issues with trying to stop it, but there's a sense that in the United States we don't have the kind of crime we used to have because we've locked more people up. Now, the data is very clear that's not the case. We are not locking people up and therefore reducing crime. But there's a sense of like, let's lock even more people up. However, our argument is 700,000 people are returning from prison to the cities every year. And if we don't create some kind of effort to get them working, we're really going to be in deep, deep trouble. And I'm going to close this quickly because I have now 1 minute at the generosity of the Italians. We're doing a few different things, and every program we're doing is a little different. In Oakland, we have the citizens of Oakland so concerned about San Quentin and gang violence have created a local program where we are getting people jobs. In Detroit, with 14% unemployment, we were able to get people jobs with a 70% retention rate, and only 5% of those people went back to prison. Juxtapose that with 67% recidivism nationwide. In New York, we have 4 upstate, including Chateauguay on the border of Canada, prisons where we teach inside the prisons. So when people come back to New York City, we can immediately get them jobs. Judges in New York City send us non-custodial parents, and we get them jobs because they're not paying for child support because they don't have jobs. We're also doing HIV to work, and we've done that for about 7 years with phenomenal success based on new drug treatments and all. We have done faith-based consultancies with the African-American black churches who have that. Cory Booker, I don't know if anyone's heard of him, but he's a very unusual mayor. He ran on the idea of he's going to help people coming out of prison. He was going to clean up Newark. He has created an America Works in Newark and other programs we've been running throughout the country. We feel, in closing, that 10 years from now, Elaine, I know, Elaine's going to say, come back. We're going to talk about the fact that there was a new initiative nationwide. It's Prison to Work, and that it will begin to address what we think is one of the major problems in our inner cities, the lack of fathers in the home, the lack of involvement of the men who aren't in their children's lives. And we think that getting this group to work, both from prison to work after they've offended, but also doing some preventative work, is really the next initiative in social policy. Thank you.
And we have Carlo.
Thank you. When I started to be invited in international seminars, a friend of me from Italian embassy told me, if you are in a Japanese contest, you start by apologizing yourself. If you are in a European contest, you start by thanking all the people. If you are in the United States contest, you tell a joke. Well, I'll do all the three, all of them. I want to thank very much Gauzy for all the work he has done up to now. It was really important. I want to apologize with you for my English, and I will also tell you a joke. A joke that is about the competition between Italian and French public administration models. The public administration of France is more central, our one is more local. We were very interested, for example, in the American model, in the Reinvented Government, of which Elaine was one of the actors. And we were interested to this, while they were much more for the centralized model, not less innovative. Well, now I have to tell we won the competition, for sure. Not even the Mr. Sarkozy, he made a commission, Attali Commission, very important one, for the reform. They worked a lot, But at the end of it, what did the President Sarkozy made? He married the Italian model. And so we won the competition. Well, actually, we have a long way to go. We have done some improvement, but we have a long way to go. Italy comes from more than 15 years of legislative reforms, accompanied by very intense political activity, even though the continuous exchange of ministries appointed for the public reform, we had 6 ministries in the last 8 years, made it impossible to implement long mid-term strategies. The critical points are evident, and they imply a widespread mistrust towards the public administration. However, problems in public administration cannot be solved in very short time measures. A serious planning with short and mid-term objectives up to 2015 is necessary. But neither citizens nor companies would accept anymore to give a long-term credit without condition to the public administration. Therefore, we think it's fundamental to agree with them on a set of indicators through which it will be possible to constantly monitor the public administration change and efficiency. Well, Formez is the agency that I lead, a governmental agency, have prepared thus an agenda that was delivered to all the prime minister candidates. In 10 days, we will have the new prime minister in Italy. We will be voting on April the 12th. This agenda has a few strategic actions for the public administration and was prepared after a research that was last about 2 years in Italy and in Europe. We tried to create a virtuous circle for the public administration. We start from understanding the public administration, I mean in Italy, but this is quite worldwide, I think, as a problem, are looped in a vicious circle that is generated by unsuccessful planning, performance under expectations, perception of the public administration as a problem, as a costly issue and not a solution, and thus a paralysis of the investment in public administration, and thus even worse performance, and is a vicious circle. We need to break these vicious circles and try to start a virtuous circle. The key factor will be a new vision of the public administration, completely opposed to the old one. Publication not focused anymore on making the system work, on making rules, but focus on the final result, the citizen satisfaction. On the basis of this value, managers and public employees' performance have to be appraised according to the results achieved against goals that must be identified together with citizens and approved together. A set of rewards and sanctions have to be defined, and future activity has to be planned. The framework of reference has to be a stronger public administration in its public mission. For this activity, public administration have to refer to following criteria. Most of them are quite known. Measurability and knowledge as adequate, reliable and measurable, and also agreed with citizen companies. Responsibility, through a clear indication of competencies and expectation of performance, and the competence of manager groups. A new vision of public administration implies more efficient management mechanism, collaboration between institutional bodies and private companies, aiming at cost optimization, long mid-term planning, result-oriented mentality. In this regard, may be necessary the public manager dignity and role get stronger. So we probably have to overcome, or at least to limit, the logic of the spoiled system that was quite a broad spread on one side, and reviewing the rules allowing the recruitment of external manager on the other. We have some strategic options for the public administration. The innovation areas where action is primarily required are for cost monitoring, a results-oriented mentality and evaluation, internet and technologies with all the opportunities, simplification of rules and procedure. I will very quickly say 3 or 4 points. The agenda takes 11 points that we would like to be followed by the Italian government, but can be also spread in others cases. The first is the structural intervention for cost reduction in the public administration through quality and quantity management of the turnover. We have an age curve in all the administration rapidly turns towards seniority. In 15 years, for example, the percentage of employees under 35 years in Italy passed from 30% to 8%, also due to the block of the turnover. The high number of retirement can be an opportunity to transform the composition of the employees from several points of view: diversification according to education, knowledge, tasks, territory, institutional level, and so on. In so doing, it's possible to trace a map of the Italian public employment in the light of a more modern idea of public services, better tailored on the final user need. Second point, an appraisal indicators of public administration performances chosen by citizen companies. For the main public service, is necessary to identify quality standards to be shared with the stakeholder. Those standards must be measured time to time. The periodic comparison of this performance also have to be available not only to public decision makers, but mostly in a widespread manner to citizens, in order to have an evolution of the national statistics system also in this sense. In other countries, there are already significant experience. In England, for example, the marks given by the British Audit Commission to public services and agencies have a wide echo in the newspaper and other for boosting and encouraging element. I only have 1 minute. I'll take 2 minutes more for my language. Well, because I think I must say something about the case, which is in any way well described in the papers, and you can have it. Well, the case we have matched is also requires tools to increase cohesion and lessons to be learned from the best experience. In many areas of the countries, there are good experiences. So we have tried to put a data bank. Is the most comprehensive data bank of innovation in public administration. We call these buoni esempi, good examples, and has been in operation since May 2003. The data bank collects project and successful experiences in innovation from all the levels of government, central, local, primary and secondary school and academies. There are more than 2,200 projects organized and classified by content criteria. It includes project support documentation and shares operating materials, guides, interactive tools, and paper from laboratories. The data bank is updated weekly through cooperation with the administration themselves and the dedicated staff of high-level editors. This is also an international section, and we hope to implement it also after this seminar. Well, thank you to everybody.
I think we had 3 terrific examples of 21st century government from 3 different countries. Lots of ideas here, and please let's take some. We'll take some questions for about 10 minutes. We'll have some table discussion and come back to questions. Okay, let's see. Who do we have here? Yes, right there.
This is Abdul Momin from Boston, and I'm a college teacher. My question to Dr. Bao is, this is about the prison, the prison that you were talking about. I understand in the United States from 1920 1920s till 2000, 1920s to till late 70s, the prison population was around 200,000. And even in 1984, it was started growing up, and now you gave a startling number, 7.3 million as prisoners in the USA. I understand at the same time that it cost around $45,000 to maintain a prisoner. I also understand that most of the prisons are being built by private sector nowadays. So my question to you, and again, to add one thing, you said 1/3 of the young men are in the prison, and around 67 to 70% minority people are in the prison in the United States. Now my question is it due to rigid laws and regulations that have been created over the years, like first strike, or you take a little drug, little 0.5 mm, and then you go into jail for 3 years, definite. Is it because of rigid laws, number one? And number two, is it because the private sector has been allowed to build prisons at the same time to maintain the prisoners, so there is an incentive?
Okay. That's a big question. First, the private sector is not the principal builder or operator of prisons in our country. It is a growing sector, but it still is a minority of the prisons. Many of the federal prisons are now being run by the private sector, but most state and local jails and prisons are run by the government sectors. The 7.3 million figure includes not only people in prison, but also people in local jails, and so they call that somewhat different. Local jails, you could be awaiting an indictment or a conviction, and parole and probation, that's supervised. But your main point about this 3 strikes and you're out, these laws that the judges were handed, that's true. There were these laws put into the books over the past 20, 25 years that required mandatory sentencing, did not allow judges to have discretion, which tended to lock people up for longer and longer periods of time. In New York, there's something called the Rockefeller Laws. So you could have somebody with minor drug-related crimes they were using, carrying, were not necessarily even dealing, and I'll see them 18 years later walk into my office, and they've been away for that long for what is relatively a minor crime. So that's been, there are many efforts nationwide to try to change this mandatory sentencing rule. So far, we haven't seen that played out.
Other questions? Yes, over here.
Hi, my name is Gitanjali. I'm from India. My question is addressed to you, Elaine. You've identified 3 forms of emerging governments, 3 models. I'd like to ask you, where would you place these 3 issues in your 3 models? The first is the role of technology, including innovations like e-governance. Mm-hmm. The second is the whole problem of limited jurisdiction due to boundary issues, as identified by the Dean. And the third is the increasing influence of INGOs. So where would you place these 3 issues in the 3 models? Thanks.
Thank you. E-government is clearly important to the first model. It's sort of the guts of the first model, that all the drive in modern bureaucracies towards increasing productivity is enabled by IT and electronic government, and that's why Maryantonett's example of the identity creation is such a perfect example of modern 21st century government. It is a core governmental process. Okay, note that very few governments would want to contract out something as central to the state as identity. And so it's a core governmental process. It is obviously something where productivity is very important, as is quality, and e-government is completely central. The second one, boundary issues. Boundary issues can be dealt with in a whole variety of ways, but many times the reasons that we move away from the bureaucratic model is because the bureaucratic model isn't very good at boundary issues. And so when government decides to create a network, often they are trying to do that to get around the artificial jurisdictional issues that come with government. And certainly when you create a market, you are really getting around those jurisdictional issues because you are in fact allowing for millions of individual adaptations to take place. And the third one was the role of INGOs. I don't discuss that very much in the book, but it is something that comes up a great deal. NGOs can be incredibly important as pieces of a network. That's where they're usually found. Now, in developing countries, the nonprofit world is almost always supported by the state. In fact, in 1996, when a little standoff between Bill Clinton and Newt Gingrich resulted in the government being shut down, Americans were stunned to find out that there were hundreds and thousands of organizations that they thought were private, not-for-profit, that in fact were getting 60, 70, 80% of their money from the federal government. Catholic Charities has 65% of its money is from the federal government. So in OECD countries, what happens is the NGOs are often the experimental implementers of these government by networks, and they're largely supported by government. In developing countries, it tends to be donors that support these NGOs. But the problem in both countries is actually very similar, which is, does the state learn from this experimentation that takes place in the NGOs? And my observation so far is, in fact, the answer is largely no, that there's not very much learning going on because the state doesn't take it as its job to systematically learn from these private sector organizations. The irony is that the reason we go to these private sector organizations in the first place is for creativity and innovation, and yet the absence of mechanisms, feedback mechanisms, becomes very difficult. In the developing world, the feedback goes back to an international donor, which may or may not help the government move things forward. In the U.S. situation, the feedback goes back to the individual funders who regard this as something they do without respect to what it means for the rest of the network. So, for instance, Peter and Lee, I have some examples from their company in the book. And one of the examples that Lee's husband, Peter, talked about is how he would go to bid for work in an individual city, and literally the performance goals were too easy to meet because the government made the performance goals easy and simple. Now, if you're America Works, your competitive advantage, to use the business term, is that you actually know something about getting people to work, so you want tougher performance goals. But the state itself was reluctant and is often reluctant to impose those tougher goals, sometimes for political reasons, sometimes they want to give, sometimes they want to make sure the contract goes to the mayor's friend and not to the organization that's best able to meet a tough performance goal. So there's a lot of problems in the government by network model in both developing and developing countries in terms of getting the learning, which is why we see time and time again, and it's funny, I just had this conversation on my way over here with a very distinguished Kennedy School professor, Lamont, who spent many years at the World Bank. And the discussion we were having was precisely this. There are many wonderful examples of success in the world. And yet, it is always extremely difficult to turn those into something that is systemic, that is governmental, that is sustainable. And this is a problem that I've been grappling with and I think is worthy of a lot of attention. And part of it is, in fact, there is no systematic feedback loop, either in any kind of country. Next question. Yes, back here.
This question to Maryantonett. How do you see the advancement of identity management, availability of access technology, and in regards to the having more people participate directly into government, and how would this be a contender, for example, to representative democracy models, when it will be, a real contender in this regard?
Well, since most of the models, either for improvements in service delivery or for more deliberative democracy, all involve some kind of technology, fundamental to both of those is how you can identify citizens in a virtual world, right? I would say that success in improving service delivery feeds the other process of having a stronger democracy, because most citizens, and especially in OECD countries and certainly in Canada, the polling and research will tell you, actually engage directly with governments when it comes to service delivery. And their responses and their appreciation of what government can do for them, either at an individual service transaction or their ability to transcend the individual service transaction to their relationship with government at a broader level, is directly dependent on the nature of that service transaction. So I think there are some good examples of countries that are making progress on those fronts. I think technology can play a role in both, but I think the mistake that people often make is to think that improvements in either is primarily the result of technology, which it isn't. It is a cultural change in both, and it is, in both cases, transformative at a level of government at where you have to weed out what the core roles and responsibilities are. So I'll just give you an example of what I mean by that. Managing identity is one of those fundamental public goods. We used to do that as governments a long time ago, and then because we got into all sorts of programs and services, we kind of forgot that that was fundamental to a lot of them. So when we established Service Canada, we established it from primarily the Social Service Department of the Federal Government of Canada, but within less than a year, one of the first services we took on for citizens across the Government of Canada was doing passport intake, because the skill set for determining eligibility and taking an application for basic social programs is not very different than the skill set that you have for actually taking in and recognizing the importance of basic identity documents, determining eligibility of whether you actually are who you say you are, and moving on. And then just to add insult to injury for those that actually don't believe in one-stop, the third service we took on was actually administering boat registration licenses. So from social services to passport intake to administering boat registration licenses, there's one common thread, and that common thread's identity and how you manage it. And the same is going to be true of how we aggregate service interactions to the broader issues of how you can transform the deliberative nature of government's interaction with citizens and strengthen democracy in the process.
Great, thank you very much. I am told that it is time for us to break into small groups, but I'm sure that our panel will be walking around here, and so you can come and get us, and we'll be here. And then at 4:30, the next piece of the program will begin. Thank you, and thank you for the panelists.